Me on this episode of Teaching Through Times and Seasons. I feel like, a rather interesting topic to discuss tonight that just seemed like it was pretty relevant, like the Lord kept bringing it up over the week. And that is the issue of time and the prophets and the prophetic words and how those two fit together. Um, I have a saying that I tend to use a lot, which is prophets can't tell time. And by and large, it's pretty true. There have actually been some words that is going to evolve and change in our day, but the reality is, historically speaking, it is very difficult for prophets to understand timing and what time they're seeing. And let me explain why. When the prophet gets a prophetic word, they're literally being taken outside of time. If you think about John in the book of Revelation, we try to read Revelation chronologically. We try to read his phraseology when he says, and then this happened, and then I saw this, and then I saw this. And we try to put that on a timeline when the reality is John was outside of time when that happened. And so just because he saw it at that moment doesn't mean that it happened following what he saw previous to that. He was completely outside of time. Prophets, when they get a word or they have a vision or however it comes to them, they are taken outside of time. And a lot of times, prophets try to then interpret their words based on their understanding of time, and that often is inaccurate. And so what happens is we disregard the prophetic word because it didn't happen in the timeline that they specified. Now, I understand how the prophetic and time doesn't always fit together. In 2010, I wrote a book, and I really asked the Lord while I was writing this book, please don't let this be what I called a 10-year prophecy. In other words, this isn't even going to make sense for 10 years. And the reason I was saying that is because I'd read several of Rick Joyner's books 10 years after he had written them, and I realized, oh my gosh, this is about this day. And yet the way he wrote it, it seemed like it was at that time. And yet it was a 10-year fulfillment. Well, when I wrote When Kingdoms Collide in 2010, it really began to come into clarity then in 2020. So sure enough, it was a 10-year prophetic book. And even though I pretty much knew that's the way it would be, there was a few things that shocked me. In 2020, the Lord told me to go back and read my own book. And so I did. I went back, and some of the things that stood out, we are so distracted by the way things are that we could easily be thrown by the change that is coming. Are our ministries dependent upon the structures which currently house them? What would we do if we woke up tomorrow and there was no church building to gather at? What if it was disallowed by the powers that be? What if there was no Christian university to go to work at? What if there was no large nonprofit organizational ministry headquarters? Do we know our jobs and our placement in the Army well enough to continue on in the calling if the structures were to collapse? In 2020, we found out what it was like to wake up and not be able to go to the church and not be able to go to those large ministry headquarters. And then I wrote on page 16, so the shakings promised in Hebrews 13 will come. The shakings will come, and they will change what we are accustomed to. They will change our routines. They will change the way we express Christianity. They will change the way we operate in the business world. They will change our priorities and our pastimes. This kind of restructuring is necessary in order for the people of God to be transformed into the army of God. Well, I mean, I don't know. Would you say that the way we do business has changed? I feel like it has. I remember the day when the very idea of being able to work from home was like only for the highest most elite of the world, and it was like a dream, that we could actually work from home. And there came a day when you were only allowed to work from home. You weren't allowed to go into the office. And how many businesses, a huge percentage, have continued to structure their businesses that way so that people aren't coming into the office, at least not on a daily basis, that they primarily do work from home. So much of our structure and routines and business dealings have changed and will continue to change. Certainly, we know we're seeing changes in the areas of currency, etc. There are things that are still changing. There are shakings that are still going on. And this kind of change is necessary in order for the people of God to be transformed into the army of God. So I was sharing all that to get to the point that there are things that we say that we can't really put our finger on what or when that applies. Now, this past week, a prophetic word from Lana Vawser. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Lana Vawser, but one of her words that she'd written was brought to my attention by some dear friends. And I was really amazed at how applicable it is for the time we're in. But it was written August 2018. So 4 years ago now, she wrote this word. And so I wanted to look at this word for a couple of reasons. Number one, I feel like it needs to be brought to our attention again at this moment in time so that we can derive the encouragement that it provides, so that we can feed off of the instruction that's in that word. But also, I wanted to do a little bit of a case study on what a prophetic, what are some signs of a prophetic word that was given, in a sense, ahead of its time, before its time, right? But I did also want to give some biblical examples. Much of what Lana wrote about, and as I said, this word was written August 30th, 2018, and I will put a link somewhere in the description so you guys can go read it in its entirety. It's pretty lengthy. I'm definitely not going to read all of it, but I want to refer to parts of it, and then you guys can go and read it. And it's entitled "The Gates of Victory Are Now Open." But she spoke in the past tense throughout a lot of this word. Things that, well, this has happened to you, and this has happened to you, and this has happened to you. And I'm sure it made some sense in 2018, but now in 2022, it seems very, very, very relevant and significant in ways that I'm sure it did not in 2018. At least when I look back at my life, it wouldn't have applied like it does now. But there's biblical examples of that as well. And a perfect one is Isaiah's reference, as he said, speaking of the Messiah who was to come, he said he was wounded for our transgressions, and by his stripes we were healed. He speaks of Jesus' crucifixion in the past tense, yet here he was quite some time before Jesus' birth. And it's accurate in the sense that Jesus is the lamb that was slain from the foundations of the world, correct? So in a spiritual sense, of course, outside of time, that Jesus' sacrifice and crucifixion had already taken place, and the blood was already applied. That's why the blood of lambs and goats and sacrifices in the Old Testament could be effective, because it was really just a representation of the blood that Jesus had shed, even though in time it had not happened yet. This is outside of time. So Isaiah was taken outside of time, and he saw this in the past tense. So therefore he said he was wounded for our transgressions, and we were healed. And that's true. The graces of the Old Testament are dependent upon something that happened within time, because they were applied at the foundations of the world, because God is outside of time. So the Psalms are prophetic intercessory worship. The Psalms are some of the most prophetic, I mean, just, oh my goodness. The prophetic worship that came out of the Davidic tabernacle is just mind blowing. The things that David and others sang about in a worship probably had no idea what they were really saying, and yet prophesied thousands of years into the future. And much of that is still coming to pass. So, also, we see a lot of times in the Old Testament, and it's true again, even today, that when Old Testament prophets would prophesy, often there was a current fulfillment or a fulfillment that was going to happen maybe in the next year or 10 years. And then there was a fulfillment that was going to happen. Often, many of those were messianic in nature. So they were going to happen at the birth, death, life of Christ. And then those verses may also yet apply to Jesus' second coming. So there is an element of prophecy that is multidimensional. And so you can have a word, and I'm sure this word from Lana Vawser in 2018 was much like this. Did it apply in 2018? I'm sure it did. I'm sure there's many people that read that and could really connect and relate with it. But did it apply in the way that it applies nationally and globally today? No. This is a completely new fulfillment. So it's a multidimensional word. So I'm going to kind of talk through some of the word, and we're going to look at some things that stand out. What are some clues? Like if you're reading a word that's been written sometime before, what are some clues that that prophetic word might apply now, might apply today? Here are some things that would indicate that a word may have been ahead of its time or have a greater fulfillment in the present than it did in the past. Number one is things that either didn't make sense when that word was given or seemed only mildly applicable at that time are profoundly relevant in another time. So there may be something that either you just don't get it at all, it just doesn't make sense at all, or maybe certain people say, oh yeah, that's what I've been experiencing in my life. But the vast majority of people would go, yeah, kind of, I guess. But then in another time, it is extremely applicable. And I feel like this word from Lana Vawser really falls in that category. Like, yes, there were probably individuals that could really relate to this word in 2018, but we can all relate to it on a new level now in 2022. So one of the things she said, the reason the battle is so capitalized, is so strong, and has been so strong, is because of the magnitude of breakthrough victory that is upon you. Okay, so since 2020, we have experienced a battle that is really, we've never seen anything like it before. We've been going through an intensity of ongoing, nonstop, evolving battle. It changes from one front to another. We get one thing dealt with and something else crops up. But the intensity of the battle has been just extreme since 2020. And yet in 2018, she was writing, the reason this battle is so strong is because of the magnitude of victory that's coming upon you. So now we can relate to this in a different level. There's a call to stand in this word. She says, you are moving into your land of victory. Do not shrink back. Do not cower in fear, but stand. Now is the time to stand. And then she gives the Ephesians 6:10-13 passage that talks about when you've done all to stand, stand therefore. Well, if you remember, standing was a theme, particularly in the end of 2020 and the beginning of 2021, that we have to stand in what we know to be true, because the world, the news, the media, everything is telling us that everything we know in our minds that is true is not true. And so we're having to take a stand and to continue in that stand no matter what we hear with our ears or see with our eyes. I think it's really important. And I've mentioned this before, but we just have to really get it into our heads that we live in a time where we can't even trust what we see. We can't look at a video and see something happen and believe that because we've now seen it with our eyes. We can't, because there is technology such as deepfake technology that can create videos that even computers cannot tell if it's accurate or not. And so if you hear an accusation against somebody, or you hear something happening, or you see a video of it yourself, you cannot count on that being true. We have to learn how to discern by the Spirit of God. We have to stand on that and on His truth, and not just what we see with our senses, what we know with our own senses. So there's a call to stand in this word. An attack of unusual fear, at least 5 times in this word, she talks about the level of fear that has come against the people. Let's see. Let's use this reference. This is several pages long. That's why I said we can't go over I can't just read it all to you. Oh, okay. Well, but I didn't pick a good reference for that. Let's see, what's one of the others? The enemy has been working hard. This is it. The enemy has been working so hard with fear, intimidation, mind fogginess, confusion, and discouragement to keep you from seeing and hearing clearly. Remember what I was just saying. We can't trust what we see and hear in the natural. We have to discern by the Spirit. But the amount of fear that has been unleashed on the earth since 2020 is just, it's an unusual level of fear. And she says the fogginess and the smoke screens will begin to clear, and you will see with greater vision and insight the plans of God for your life and your families in the new season we are now in. Now, that's true, but you have to understand the fogginess and smoke screens will clear for us as we discern by the Spirit, as we learn to hear and see and exercise our spiritual senses, not our natural senses. Because I guarantee you, the smoke screens aren't going to clear for the world. It's not going to get better. It's not going to get easier to see and discern. This is only by the Spirit that we can begin to step into these promises. But we are experiencing a level of fear much more so now than we did in 2020, an attack of fear that has come against the entire world. And say, another thing that she mentions that we can just look at and go, oh, that speaks to us now in a way it did not speak to us in 2018, is she makes a reference to the turnaround. How many of you have heard the phrase, the turnaround? The turnaround is a big thing that the Spirit is talking about right now, that prophets are talking about, that people are talking about. And she says in this word, you are in your turnaround place. Now, I don't remember that being a particularly heavy word in 2018, but right now, the turnaround makes a lot of sense. We know what God is talking about when He says the turnaround, right? So those are some things that make sense to us now on a completely different level than they did 4 years ago. So the other thing is, when you're looking at a word and you're wondering, okay, is this really applicable for today, or was it just a word for that time, or was it not a word for that time at all? Was it actually for a future event? And I do want to point out the way Lana phrased this prophetic word. She simply gave it as she saw it. She did not put any timestamps on it. She did not say, in the next 6 months. She didn't do any of that. So there's nothing to contest with here and say, well, she misinterpreted or labeled this wrong. No, she just gave the word. It just happened to be one of those words that, as I said, applied at the time, but boy, does it apply on a different level now. So one of the things you want to look for is repetitions or themes in a word, and how they correspond with the current themes in our culture and what's going on now. So there's at least 4 of those themes in this word that she gave that speak to us again on a completely different level. And the one that really stands out to me the most, because it's been a word the Lord has spoken to me to share with the intercessors, everybody really, but especially the intercessors. She uses this repetitiously throughout. At least 3 times she says this phrase that she heard God saying, "You won and you win. You won and you win." Now, I think I only shared, I think I only shared this word on my Fast Forward Intercessory page on Facebook. Well, we have a group of people that were specifically praying for the elections in 2020, fasting and praying every Tuesday for 12 weeks for the elections. And of course, praying for righteousness, praying for life. Praying, I mean, everything we were praying about was really to see a culture of life restored to our nation. And so I I taped a video then and just put it on that page, or I think I might have put it on the Incense Arising page as well, because many of them were praying along with us at the same time for the elections. But those who were praying in 2020, there was such a burden on my heart. In 2022, when Roe v. Wade was overturned, I had to get on there and tell these intercessors that had cried out day and night, that had fasted, that had changed their priorities, their schedules, and their lifestyles in order to hit their faces, get on their knees, and to call out and cry out to God for the salvation of this nation and the earth. And I had to get on there and tell them, "You won. You won," because I feel like that it hasn't been widely recognized because the victory was so far removed from the battle. We really fought the battle in 2020. And in 2020, it occurred, it really happened. Second Chronicles 7:14 really came to pass that the people humbled themselves and prayed and turned from their wicked ways, and God released healing to the land at that moment. But we didn't see it happen until 2022. So it's really important for us to say, "You won." You won. God is victorious. You are victorious, and God is faithful. You're victorious and God is faithful, because those are the accusations that came from the kingdom of darkness against the intercessors and everyone that were taking a stand for righteousness at that time, is that they were not victorious, that they were defeated, and that there was nothing they could do to change circumstances, and that God wasn't faithful to his word. So we had to reveal that. You won and you win. So, and that's exactly the point, is because we can look back and say, "Hey, we prayed, we humbled ourselves, we fasted, we did everything we knew to do. We quoted the scripture, we sought God, we repented, we did all that we knew to do, and God came through." And what that tells us is he'll come through again. As we continue to press into him, he will continue to pour out his spirit. We don't have to live in defeat. And the message is, you won and you win. Now, that word in 2022 makes a lot more sense than it made in 2018. So that's one of the repetitious themes throughout this word that she gives. Now, you will definitely recognize this second theme that I'm going to refer to. But she at least 6 times refers to the blood of Jesus and or communion. And this is what she says. "I have mentioned in previous words recently that taking communion is crucial right now. And I want to remind you of that again. Taking communion is a vital key to breakthrough and seeing the manifested victory of Jesus in your life." So here we are in the 4th quarter of 2022, and we've been doing this extensive series on the Great Communion Revival and unfolding prophetic words that apply to the Great Communion Revival, seeing how Lou Engle has been carrying this burden for the Great Communion Revival for 20 years, which is just now beginning to truly break open. And we're actually seeing, I can't get ahead of myself because I'm not done with the series. There's some things I still have to talk to you guys about. And so I'm not going to give it away just yet, but we are seeing it happen. We're seeing some of those things that we've been talking about in these recent videos that God would release on the earth through communion actually manifesting. The Great Communion Revival, my friends, is beginning. It is happening, and there are miracles taking place even now. So she talks about this, how vital, how important communion is. Now, did that make sense in 2018? I'm sure it did. It certainly did to some of us that had been hearing a little bit from the Spirit about it, but does it make sense now? Oh, on a whole new level. Yeah, it really makes sense now. The third theme that is repetitious throughout this word is, and she says this 6 times, you will write about this. You will write about this. Now, what does that mean? Well, that's a reference, an indication of the unprecedented historical times that we're currently living in. Since 2020, the word unprecedented has just been like a common household word. We use it all the time because everything we've encountered has been unprecedented. It's historical in nature. And so, yeah, we are living in a time that history will record. And so she's saying you will write about this, and that you're going to write about how you overcame. You're going to write about God's faithfulness. Through all of this, you're going to write about the things that God did and released in the midst of this storm and warfare and chaos. You will write about this. And so that, again, does that make sense now in a way that it wouldn't have made sense in 2018? Yeah, it does. Yeah, it really does. And the last theme that she mentions, actually from the very beginning of the word all the way to the last page, is one that let's see, it shows up at least 6 times again. And here's what she says. Let's see, there's so many references. I'm trying to, this is, I think, the most important reference. She said, the Lord spoke to me, the enemy has tried to cage many, but I am now releasing greater favor upon them. The enemy has tried to cage you. That's what she said over and over again. The enemy has tried to cage you. She says at the very last sentence, fear has tried to squash and cage you, but my power will astonish you. Over and over again, the enemy has tried to cage you. So what do we call quarantine? Being caged, right? So the enemy has tried to cage us since 2020, and there's been just reoccurrences of things now and again of how lockdowns might happen in other time periods. There's lockdowns still going on in other countries. There's all kinds of different ways of government or powers trying to keep people isolated and locked in so they can't get together and riot or whatever it is that they're scared of. The enemy has tried to cage you. Now, in 2018, did that caging of the enemy make a lot of sense? I'm sure some people felt on a personal level that they were locked up. I'm sure some people felt like they were caged in some way. But does that make sense in 2022 after what we've lived through over the last 2 years? That makes a lot more sense now. The enemy has tried to cage you, but the power of God will astonish you. And like I said, I wanted to bring that word to the forefront again, so I will link it and you can read it in its entirety. It's very encouraging. I know I brought out some highlights that maybe didn't seem that way, but it was very encouraging, and it has some strategies in there such as communion and participation in the covenant meal with the Lord. So there's strategies in there that should help you navigate the day that we're in right now, because I think, as we've established, it speaks to this day on a whole new level. And it's just a very interesting case study to look and see. So when there's a prophetic word that has a new level of application in a different time, how can we identify that that word is actually for now, and why? Why is it that sometimes prophetic words are attributed to a certain time period, or even said in a year or in 6 months or in 2 weeks, this is going to happen? Well, it's because it's very difficult for prophets standing outside of time, and maybe they don't even understand that. Not every prophet has been taught the theological realities of what they're experiencing, especially younger ones. So they may not even be fully aware that, hey, I'm standing outside of time and I'm seeing something that looks like it's in the past, but actually hasn't even happened yet. So of course they might attribute it to, and I can't begin to convey to you the sense of urgency that usually comes, sense of urgency or even immediacy that comes with a prophetic revelation. So you just know that this is going to happen soon. And by soon, I mean tomorrow. But it's because of where you were standing when you saw it, because of the fact that you were outside of time, and it's true and it's going to happen. And so it comes with this level of urgency and immediacy that you try then to put into the English language. Because again, this stuff doesn't come in English. Most often you're not given, I mean, it happens sometimes, write these words and you are given exact words to write down. But most often it's a sense, it's an awareness. It's things you see and hear and smell, and you try to put that into words that people can understand. And so have some grace. Have some grace on the prophets that they might have difficulty conveying to you what they see in eternity and bringing that back into time. A lot of times they, don't necessarily translate it very well into our natural realm. So I hope that was helpful, interesting. Certainly is a good study on prophetic words and how they can apply in different times in our history. So we will see you next time on Teaching Through Times and Seasons.